Dr. Gabrielle Fundaro, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's absolutely a pleasure.
It's been fun doing the prep. I really actually enjoyed it because you're sort of hard to define. Um, you know,
Yeah,
can't put
yes.
Gabrielle in a box, and we don't want to. We never would.
Yeah.
But you've had a pretty broad career spanning lots of sort of different things. For people who aren't not so familiar with your work, can you just give a slight background of yourself and sort of how you got to where you're at the moment?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So my undergrad is in exercise, sport, and health education. And back in the day, I thought I would own a gym, be a personal trainer. But then I really fell in love with skeletal muscle metabolism and hypertrophy specifically, and realized that I loved tutoring and teaching. And so I decided to pursue my doctorate so I could teach at the university level. And during the course of my doctorate, I shifted gears from focusing on hypertrophy to looking at the link between gut microbiome and human metabolism. And this was way back before like gut health was a popular thing. So I finished my doctorate in 2014 and went on to teach at a medium-sized university. And that lasted about 4 years. During that time, I was recruited by Renaissance Periodization to be an online nutrition coach. And going into my fifth year of teaching, I had to make the decision to either pursue what was the equivalent of tenure or resign, because you kind of like, you can't just hang out and pursue coaching full time. And I really had fallen in love with coaching, and I was at a place in my career where I felt fairly comfortable enough to take that leap, and it turned out very well. I was able to coach full time, travel, and speak internationally, and that's when I showed up as sort of the person who spoke about gut health, which was the idea of Mike Israetel. I can't take full credit for that, because he said, "Don't you have your doctorate in this or something?" And I was like, "Yeah, kind of." So after 4 years with RP, I went completely on my own and started to focus more on my business. And that's when I also started to collaborate quite a lot with my friend Shannon Beer. And I moved away from speaking so much about gut health and started focus on what I was more passionate about, which was really dismantling diet culture and pointing out weight stigma in the industry and sort of the harms that we had normalized in the pursuit of, this thin ideal, and still spoke somewhat about gut health more from a diet culture and pseudoscience perspective. And over the last few years, I have focused in an oscillating way on one or the other more. But I recently officially announced my retirement from creating new gut health content because my heart just was not in it. And I was holding myself back from pursuing what I'm most passionate about. And so that's what I'm focusing on once again is to communicate about the potential risks of cosmetic weight loss, and then also provide alternatives so people can still potentially pursue intentional weight loss in a safer way. And I still speak about ways that we can combat those issues as coaches in the industry.
Love it. So it's a really interesting topic, and I think anyone who's sort of grown up with in the fitness world, or I guess I know your background is sort of bodybuilding and things like this. I think one can go into it thinking everything you're doing is aligned with a healthy life, and actually there's some weird paradox around that whole fitness and diet culture, and actually what it means to live a healthy, long life. Could you just speak to that for a second? Because I know you've got some personal experience with the whole field as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So I started dieting and trying to control my physique and body weight when I was 18 or 19, because I thought, well, if I'm going to be a personal trainer and I'm going to own a gym, I'm going to have to look the part or no one's going to take me seriously. And that quickly escalated to a full blown eating disorder. And I was diagnosed with that a few years later, and went to therapy and pursued treatment for that for a few years thereafter. By the time I graduated, by the time I finished grad school, I was in a relatively better place than when I had been in the full depths of my eating disorder. But I still had a lot of unidentified at that time body image disturbance and many disordered eating tendencies that I had chalked up to just a normal, like, I'm dedicated, this is my lifestyle, and I'm being healthy. And it wasn't until my early 30s. I did a bodybuilding show at 27, and I saw that absolutely sent me back into my eating disorder. But I was able to sort of self help myself back to a better place. By the time I hit 30, and I had at that point started to pursue powerlifting, and so I was focusing more on performance, but I still had the idea that I had to be my leanest, smallest, strongest self all the time. And then once I started traveling internationally, I felt that my world had become so small and I had become so restricted in what I was allowed to eat, and how I would say like neurotic I was about maintaining my workout schedule, that I was not able to fully enjoy experiencing other cultures. And I had this sort of values shift or values identification of, actually, I really crave novelty and adventure, and I'm feeling pulled in these two directions of, I felt very anxious about not being able to track my food or missing a workout. But at the same time, I wanted to be able to, yeah, try new foods and feel relaxed and okay with the fact that sometimes my schedule was going to change. And so that really started a years long process to move back to a more internally regulated way of eating, to relax and have a more balanced relationship with a fitness type lifestyle. And it coincided really with the work that I was doing with Shannon. And that's when I started to realize, oh, a lot of the things that I've been doing that I have normalized are still tied into my body image disturbance and the remnants of my eating disorder. And I'm perpetuating this in other people as well, because I could see in my clients that some of them were mirroring some of the behaviors and thoughts that I had that I knew were problematic for myself. And I thought, well, how can I help these people with their goals without perpetuating this? And I actually couldn't. Like, those things are you can't, it's you can't separate those when someone's trying to change their body for those reasons.
Do you think it's a symptom of this, I guess, the traditional fitness culture in America and Europe?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And this has been a symptom that we've been experiencing for a century now, because in the early 1900s, we started to identify, we started to understand as a general public the link between energy balance, so like calories in versus calories out, and body size. And it just so happened that that intersected with with World War I and historical events that created a lot of propaganda around food conservation. And so the thin ideal emerged, and we started to look at large bodies as a sign of being a bad American, essentially. Like, you're not doing your civic duty if you are hoarding food in the form of body fat. And so that's when we started to see these ideas emerge, that a person in a large body is lazy, they're not being productive, they're not doing their duty. Whereas previous to that time period, a person in a large body was seen as healthy, robust, someone who has a lot of wealth and abundance, and it was seen as a sign of, yeah, prosperity. So that idea has been sustained for the last 100 years. And I think because the US has such a strong influence on other areas of the world as well, that thin ideal is present in other societies. Not all of them. There are societies where still people are revered for having a larger body. But this idea that a person in a large body is lazy, unmotivated, unhealthy, and using too many resources. We see that still when we're looking at like medical resources. People still believe that. It's just, we're not looking at food conservation because that's not really a problem for us, but now it's medical resources. And the flip side of that is person in a smaller body. We assume that they're have better character, that they're more motivated, dedicated. And so when we see a before and after picture, we don't just see a change in the body. We see, oh, the person after, like, they really applied themselves, and that's why they're smaller now, because they did all of the right things. They made better choices, and so they're smaller, and that's better.
It's such an interesting thread on, okay, what is healthy? Objectively, no one's trying to sell me
Mm-hmm.
anything. There's no narrative, there's no like propaganda, versus what is this accumulation of, I don't know, some 1980s fitness magazine, which then gets perpetuated through like Arnold movies and Sylvester Stallone
Yeah.
movies and Baywatch. You got to look a certain way, whether you're male or female, all the way through up until like, men's fitness or whatever. And if you aren't looking like a cover model 24/7,
Hmm.
male or
Hmm.
female, you're lesser than. But yet
Yeah.
the dislocation of they're not healthy. That is
Yeah.
not the epitome of health. Like, you take the blood when they're having that shot done, they're
Hmm.
crawling to that shoot. Could you talk
Yep.
about the misconceptions of that image of health versus
Oh,
an
sure.
actual healthy lifestyle?
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I think you like that we have to start with the fact that health is very difficult to define. And when we look at the World Health Organization's definition, it's just the absence of disease or infirmity. Well, how many people can really fit that definition? Because we have to think of health beyond just the physical. Even when we're talking about, you can be physically unhealthy, looking very fit. Well, you could have good blood work and look physically fit and be struggling with a mental health disorder. You could be struggling with the epidemic of loneliness because you don't have any social connections. You can be struggling with a sense of just meaninglessness in your life. You can feel lost. And the model of flourishing health is a more, I think, comprehensive and defined model where we're looking at the physical aspects, the social aspects, the psychological, and the what we call philosophical. So if we're assuming that, someone who looks healthy, because they're lean, the assumption is, well, because that person is leaner, then we assume they're happier. So we kind of assume that the boxes are all ticked. Well, it must be that they have friends and, they feel good about themselves. That person we just assume is globally healthy. Whereas we assume that a person in a large body, because they're in a large body, they lack character, they have these character flaws or personality flaws. There's no way that they could be happy because they're in a large body. There's no way that they could be confident. There's no way that they have as many friends. And we see this portrayed in the media, even in movies and whatnot. Like, the person in a large body is usually not the main character who's living a fulfilled life. So when we have all of these assumptions in place, then we default to the belief that, this person who looks lean is healthy all the way through. And really, like you mentioned, that could be that, yeah, they're completely depleted in that very lean state, and they could be battling with an eating disorder and, feelings of isolation and relationship problems. So the assumption is it's kind of harmful for everyone, because then what does it mean when you then regain weight, when you don't have that lean physique? Then we assume, oh, well, you've let yourself go, like, you've made poor decisions. So, like how you said, we have assumed that there's this lesser than, and we assume that in a global way, and we assume that about ourselves as well. If we start to lose that very lean physique, like, this is a moral failing. I'm failing as a person because I can't maintain that physique. Like, what's wrong with me?
For sure. I mean, whether it's physique or
Mhm.
sport or any sort of
Mhm.
physical endeavor where the results are, on a fitness test if you're doing well or not, and whatever lifts. I know you
Mhm.
mentioned powerlifting before. I think everyone
Mhm.
has have had been on that spectrum to some point.
Oh, for
If they
sure.
listen to this podcast, you can probably assume. Um,
Mhm.
and it's an interesting knot to untie. I feel like a lot of the misconceptions around this whole world and diet culture. Oh, actually, maybe that's the next question. Do you think it's more of an education around a new way to do it, or it's people have to unlearn toxic things they've learned? How do you think about that?
Oh, I really think it's both, because we have to help people replace those old beliefs with something that's more accurate. And there is research on the effects of things like popular media, and even when we're looking at like fitness advertising, and how those affect a person's beliefs about themselves. And it's not that there's a direct linear relationship where a person sees a before and after photo and then immediately feels badly about themselves. It really is dependent on the amount of weight stigma that they have internalized. So the information that they receive about body size and personality or character, some people internalize or believe less of it. And they are a little bit more protected or immune to the other harmful information. And they also may have some additional protection against the ability to, say, like, use macros, and how that might initiate a disordered eating pattern. So, on the other hand, if a person has internalized a lot of that weight stigma, then they're more likely then to be at risk of developing these disordered eating patterns. But the thing is, you first have to identify that you have internalized weight stigma, because these beliefs can masquerade as your own values. You may say, well, I value health, and that's why I need to be smaller. Well, that's based on the assumption that smaller is healthier, that you're healthier when you're leaner. And unless you have hard evidence for that fact, that like, hey, if you get above, 16% body fat, then your blood work really gets poor, which is very unlikely, then you're just making that assumption based on the internalized weight stigma, all the messaging that you've got. And so you're more likely then to be preoccupied about your body. You're more likely to have weight control beliefs. So kind of you're likely to simplify the energy balance equation. And we see this quite often in fitness. And so if we can start by identifying that and saying, oh, actually, well, that belief is rooted in weight stigma. Well, but what do I replace that with? Because this is what I've operated with for my entire life. Well, then can I really be healthy at different sizes? And the human psyche is such that it is very difficult for us to go from like one set of beliefs to a completely opposite set of beliefs. And that's usually what we see, like when our alternatives are, oh, well, then everyone's healthy at every size. Well, that's not necessarily the case either. Um, so it really is about helping people, yeah, start to unlearn those initial beliefs, identify what their true values are versus what they've internalized from the rest of society, and then start to set their own values based on what they know to be true about themselves, and then based on actual evidence. Because it's not that there is a lack of evidence about the impact of weight stigma or cosmetic weight loss. It's just that the evidence is very nuanced and it's hard to communicate and sometimes hard to understand and hard to implement, and it doesn't sell very well.
Mm, it doesn't. It really
Yeah.
doesn't. How do you, just shifting gears to self-worth and eating habits?
Hmm. Yeah.
How are the two how are the two linked, and how do you help people with who are struggling with that?
Oh, absolutely. And this is a topic that I've started speaking about more recently because I sort of had this epiphany. Because, we talk so much about helping people to feel good about themselves. And even in their pursuit of cosmetic weight loss. Now, when I say cosmetic weight loss, I mean weight loss that is intended to help someone like their body's appearance more. And that masquerades as improved body image, although it actually isn't. So, when we are helping a person pursue cosmetic weight loss, at the end of that, they usually do feel better about themselves. They feel more confident and more capable. And a lot of times people are now starting to move away from weighing and using the scale and say, well, we're focusing on the process. We're focusing on the behaviors. But a person can still tie their self-worth, like what they feel, their level of value in society, to their ability to control their eating habits and therefore control their body size. So at the end of that process, we may have actually just further perpetuated those beliefs. And so they feel good about themselves because at the end of that process, they are smaller, they have a leaner physique. And we haven't actually addressed the core body image issues. We've just made their body less triggering to them. So they don't have as many of those negative body image thoughts and experiences. But if they were to regain the weight because they had tied their self worth to their ability to control their eating habits and body, now what does that mean about their self-worth? Now they look at that again as a personal moral failing. Like, I did this the first time. Why can't I maintain it? Why can't I do it again? This seems to be getting harder and harder every time. I'm too lazy. I'm just unmotivated. And instead of viewing this as a normal physiological process, they look at it as though there's something wrong with them. And so we still have not helped them to detach from their appearance. And that's where we can really help people, is to say your appearance actually does not determine your worth. It doesn't say anything about your personality or your character. And so your ability to control your body or control your eating habits doesn't mean that you are a better person than someone who does not. But it's very difficult to do that because A, we can't show a before and after picture of that process. And B, it's hard to sell to people who are afraid of kind of experiencing the loss of identity and the and coping with the changes in their body as they start to control it less. The
Mm.
likelihood is that yes, you will probably gain some weight and lose some muscle and have some fluctuations because you're no longer trying to constantly control and suppress your body weight. And that is difficult for people. It's scary because what are the potential consequences of that in this society where we are judged based on how we look? Because it's not just us. It's not just like, oh, I changed my mindset and then like the rest of the world treats me differently. No, you change your mindset so you can cope with how the rest of the world treats you based on how you look. And that's unfortunate that we have to do that.
It's really interesting hearing you say this, because in the prep for this episode, I really underestimated how many people go through this line of thinking. And it's
Mm-hmm.
not something that people talk about so much, and it's not something you can see. You can't hear someone in a monologue.
Yeah.
But I imagine the control over, actually, I guess the control of the underlying problem in losing the weight or restricting diet actually is almost like scratching an itch. It feels good,
Yep. Yep.
but doesn't actually solve the problem. So what steps do you take with people to try and detach from their own identity and their eating habits?
Mm. Yeah. I'll, in a very practical way, this is one of the first things that I start working on with clients is that when you have tied your self worth to your appearance, you tend not to have a solid idea about who you are outside of that small portion of yourself. And so we start with identifying values. And I usually do just a values sorting exercise. You choose 5 to 10 of your most important values. These are just single concepts that help you to create principles or sort of guidelines for how you want to live. And from there, we look at how many of these values are really showing up in your life versus those that you might be neglecting or that you don't feel like you have room for. Quite often, I see that people value things like freedom and adventure and authenticity and spontaneity, but they don't have room for those in their lives because they are also so preoccupied about their appearance and controlling their eating habits. And they get a sense of control from doing those things. They get a sense of like agency in their lives. And the next step is working through what I call the intentional action grid, which is based on the acceptance and commitment therapy matrix. This is more of a coaching take on it, where a person looks at, they sort of list out their most important values, the most important people in their lives, the identity, like the person that they really want to be, and those internal struggles that they experience while they're trying to interact with those people and do those things. And then the really important secondary analysis to that is what am I doing to get short-term relief? And then what am I doing to actually like resolve this and get some long-term satisfaction? And quite often, the reverting back to a strict macro plan, pursuing intentional weight loss is like you said, scratching the itch. It is a short-term relief maneuver. And the long-term satisfaction that you would get from like resolving your body image issues takes a lot longer and a lot more time and effort and energy, and it's more difficult. And so the intentional weight loss and the pursuit of, and the usage of macros is a way to get relief from the discomfort of having a bad body image day. And it's much rarer that people will say, oh, actually they like that they'll identify, oh, this actually is only short-term relief. This is a slightly longer version of like doom scrolling on my phone, because doom scrolling takes maybe a couple of hours and then I can, follow macros and lose weight in a couple of months. So that's the next step, is where we start to identify like this actually isn't serving your long-term goals and it's excluding values that are of great importance to you. So what can we start to do instead to really move toward what you actually want, which is to feel comfortable in your body, to feel good about yourself, to trust yourself. We don't have to do the weight loss in between. That's just a middleman. That's just a detour. There are evidence-based ways to move from point A to point B in terms of improving body image and feeling better about yourself.
What have you learned from your clients that surprised you?
Oh,
I guess
um,
surprised you the most.
yeah, what surprises me the most is that you don't always have to have a specific goal. Like you don't always have to have a defined, break it down into small pieces, like specific end point. Once you get to a place where a person is practicing living according to their values and practicing responding to their body's cues and meeting their needs, it's actually really hard to set goals in that way. And the goals that you do set are usually very, they're sort of abstract or vague, because what you need to do is provide freedom for that person to pursue that thing in the way that suits them best in that moment. And neither one of you can predict the future, and they're going to know themselves best. So as I started to practice this with more clients, and I started to feel sort of at a loss for coming up with like a specific goal and to track that goal and see how things are going. But because I was at a place in my coaching career where I really started to understand, like, my role as a coach is not to provide results or solutions or answers to everything. It is to facilitate my clients' growth. That I was like, I'm just going to have to see how this goes. And sometimes even clients would say, like, well, what are we doing now? Like, we don't have any goals. And I would say, well, I mean, we can start to come up with some, but yeah, it is a little bit challenging right now because we're in a place where you don't have goals about changing your body or hitting specific macros. You just have goals, the general goal, the general aim to like live according to your values. But what surprises me is that people will so embrace that, and they will, I mean, take it and like do things that I never would have even imagined that they would do in terms of like applying our work together. Like, oh, you asked for a raise. That's not a goal that we had ever set, or you told a person that you had feelings for them, or, you started a club, or, you just did these things from a place of actual agency and self-worth and authenticity. We didn't have to set goals for that, but it's so incredible to see that when a person is given the opportunity to flourish, like, they'll grow. It's like like a plant. Like, you water it and you give it some fertilizer and you put it in the sun, and there are plants that just absolutely explode over the course of a few weeks. It's like, wow, I had no idea that was going to be the result.
It's funny, thinking about this a lot recently with regards to goals, and sometimes actually not having goals frees up so many other options that you never even entertained, and actually just trusting the
Yes.
process a bit can, you can end up doing great things. But if you get fixed on one goal, you miss everything that could have been. We've
Yep.
had lots of neuroscientists on recently, and they dispel the myth that your brain's not plastic, and especially as you age, it's infinitely plastic, and that's a sort of misconception. Another one is that the foundational idea of things like the film Limitless, like we only use 40% of our brain. Not true. We use
Right.
all of our brain, right? saying
Yes.
that, saying that, I think if you're fixated on controlling something in your head and your inner monologue is tuned into one radio station all the time, it could be the functional equivalent of you're not using your full potential. So when you can free that up to focus on other areas, your life can be enriched in various different things. Which leads me to my next question. How can you, through going through this process of what I've understood, if I'm correct from your everything you're saying, is you're actually helping people detach and actually let go of their previous identity being connected. So when it comes to things like intuitive eating, how can you help people trust themselves?
Oh, I love that question. What I found too is when people have a difficult time trusting themselves, it's not just around food. It's generally based on a core belief that they don't make good choices, that they doubt themselves. They don't really know who they are. And so they often don't um, practice authenticity in other areas either. So it's like with their family or their friends, they feel kind of like they're wearing a mask. And so the process of developing that self trust sometimes does start with food, but sometimes it's in a small act of, speaking up for themselves or saying, like, hey, I've had enough to eat. I don't, I'm sorry, grandma, like, I really had enough to eat. Or, hey, I actually don't want to do the diet talk this time, with their friends. But self trust, I view it like any relationship. We have a relationship with ourselves in a sort of a meta way. We regard ourselves in a certain way. And when we have had months or years of experience quote unquote letting ourselves down because we keep wanting to follow a strict macro plan and we keep failing ourselves, or we try to restrict a certain food and then we end up eating it and feeling completely out of control. We start to gather evidence. Well, I can't trust myself. I am out of control. I actually, I have to have macros. I have to have someone to tell me what to do, because if left to my own devices, I'm going to, go off the rails. I think first it starts with education around why that's actually happening. And oh, it's actually the restriction that is perpetuating this cycle. And one of the things that I practice is unconditional permission to eat. And that's often, it's very misunderstood in the same way that intuitive eating is misunderstood. It is not intentionally overeating to the point of feeling ill just because you can. It is that you give yourself the unconditional permission to do that, coupled with the intention of self-care and wanting to feel good, and knowing, this is the most important part, knowing that you don't have to eat it all right now, because you can eat it later. If you want more of this in 10 minutes, then you can go ahead and eat it then. So you don't have to do the Last Supper thing. Like, this food is going to be available to you. So when we shift to that mindset, we reduce the novelty and the anticipation of restriction. That food very quickly becomes less appealing. Like, you can eat enough of it and you can eat it at every meal if you want to. The way that you practice it is up to you. But very quickly you get to a point where that food has lost its hold over you, and you realize, oh, it's just a food like any other food, and I can eat it later if I want to. And that helps a person to build trust in themselves, because now they are having new experiences in which they feel more aligned with themselves. And they say, oh, wow, I wanted to eat that much of that food, and I did. And that felt good. And oh, I can trust myself. And then that expands to, other foods, other eating situations. So it really just takes time. Like with any relationship, a person has to show up for you repeatedly, and you build trust in layers over time. And it's the same thing with yourself, that you start to trust yourself, and you also start to adjust your expectations. So rather than trusting myself to hit my macros without trying every day, I'm not going to expect that, because I'm not counting them and it's likely not going to happen. I'm trusting myself to mostly eat nutrient dense foods and eat enough of things that I feel comfortable. And I know that sometimes I'm probably going to overeat a little bit. Sometimes I'm going to undereat a little bit. But in the grand scheme of things, based on how I'm feeling and my performance, I know what I need to be eating. And I'm also applying my nutritional knowledge in the same way that, if we're building a relationship with a person, we have appropriate expectations. Otherwise, we're going to be consistently disappointed and not have the ability to trust that person. But with the appropriate expectations and time, then we're able to build trust. And then we have a more positive experience with that person or with ourselves.
It's a really nice lesson in reframing, and then it suddenly shapes your whole worldview. What
Yeah.
did what do you wish someone had said to you when you were in the middle of struggling with disordered eating, essentially?
Oh my gosh, that's a good question. Um, I don't know that I would have believed them at the, at the worst of it, because I was so afraid of what would happen, that, if I were to gain weight, I thought that I wasn't going to be taken seriously. Um, I think probably what I would have needed is empathy and acknowledgement that it is possible that that could happen, that, you probably will gain weight and people might perceive you differently, and you might receive a different type of attention because, you're not, people aren't approaching you in the grocery store or asking you about your arms. And that, like other difficult things that you've gone through, eventually that will pass and you'll get through it and it won't bother you so much. But I think it's the acknowledgement part that we kind of skip over, because it's like, oh, change your mindset and whatnot. And that doesn't validate a person's entire set of fears and beliefs. And so seeing the truth in that, and then still giving them the option, this could happen. And on the other hand, you've named so many reasons why it's worth it to you to make this change. I think that's probably, and unfortunately, I think I said that to enough other people that I started to soak it up myself. But yeah, I think that's the thing is like, acknowledging that, yeah, it sucks to go through the process of gaining weight and no one says anything, no one compliments you on it, no one knows what's going on for you. You feel self-conscious, your clothes don't fit comfortably. It's tough. And at the end, it's so worth it because you have these days where you think back to, oh wow, if this had happened a few years ago, I would have felt this terrible way. And today I don't feel that way. Today I just feel like, oh, this is fine. And it's like living for those experiences and realizing how, how so much of it is just a distant memory now. And it was such a painful reality at the time.
I think it's people hearing your story will be able to empathize. I'm sure the it's almost a lesson in detaching from the thing, whether the thing is a business or how strong you are, how much body fat you've got, your calorie counting, whatever it is. If you are not said thing, I know I lifted weights a reasonable amount of time for over a decade and things like this, and
Mm-hmm.
you don't realize how embedded your identity is in these things until you stop doing them.
Yes.
My first business, suddenly, ownership has changed over, and I'm looking for my next thing. I'm like, so much of my self-worth was in that, but I used to go around saying, all good, the highs, the lows, I'm fine because I'm detached from it, it's not me. And then suddenly I'm not part of it. I'm like, no, a lot of me was in that, you know.
Yes.
And it's the same kind of detachment thing. um Trying to relate to you and these stories of I guess sex differences is where I'm going with this. How
Sure.
do males and females differ in this topic?
Oh, yeah. I mean, males still will deal with body image disturbance. It's just a different version. So theirs is usually more muscularity oriented. So whereas women generally will pursue the thin ideal, they want a smaller body, even if they are somewhat muscular, and society tells women, you don't be too muscular, don't get too big. Men, on the other hand, are expected to have larger muscles and to maintain a lean physique, and they're seen as sort of the protectors. And part of it is toxic masculinity and patriarchal beliefs that are harmful to both genders, to all genders, I should say. Um, so it's and I think some of it could be a matter of underreporting, that we don't actually know the how the percentages differ between men and women, and even how disordered eating behaviors and the underlying beliefs might differ. Because, for example, when we look at people might be familiar with rigid restraints, as we talk about cognitive restraint around eating and rigid restraint. Some of it's very obvious, like, strict rules, black and white thinking around food. So people say, well, use a flexible approach, use flexible restraint. Well, there's an overlap of about 50%. So like the 50% of the variance between these two, how they their thoughts and beliefs associated with each one overlap. And so one person might have a behavior like counting macros that is not tied into a background of body image disturbance and disordered eating. So they're using macros and it doesn't initiate any predisposition because there wasn't one. But another person might be doing exactly the same thing using macros, but because they already had a predisposition toward developing disordered eating, that then evolves for them. So I think when we're looking at different genders, that we have the influence of, the societal impact on how the bodies are supposed to look based on one gender or another, and then that person's internalized set of beliefs about, how much of that they have internalized, and then which of their behaviors are potentially problematic or not. So I think it's hard to um, compare, I mean, in terms of like globally, also
Mm,
because we're all like, it's at the individual level that we need to help people and assess where they are, because I'm not going to assume that macro tracking is problematic for all of my clients, but I'm also not going to assume that it's a good fit for all of them either. And I've worked with male clients who dealt with body image disturbance that did lead to disordered eating behaviors. It was just that the beliefs about how their body was supposed to look were slightly different, but not in all cases. I think it also depends on the size of body that a person has lived in, because I quite often I see when a person has come from being in a large body, they have internalized a lot of weight stigma, and their beliefs are rooted more in I am still that person, I am a fat person, and that's a bad thing to them. Whereas other people might have rooted beliefs in, oh, I am an out of control person. They never were actually in a large body, and so their internalized weight stigma is sort of like a different flavor.
Yeah, when the sex differences are, I guess, compared, it's quite difficult to put yourself in another sex's shoes and really understand that. I've
Mm-hmm.
seen it in, I won't say the name, but I know a guy who's um, blown up over Instagram over his
Mm-hmm.
physique,
Yeah.
and so much so it's reinforced maybe negative patterns of behavior
Yes.
and perpetuate trying to keep that up and actually expanding it. Drugs get
Mm-hmm.
involved, and suddenly he's had 2 heart attacks but can't stop the drugs because his whole identity is wrapped up in this thing. His whole life, his
Mm-hmm.
whole following, everything. But two
Yes.
heart attacks won't do it, and it's really sad. And yeah, I don't know him too well, but it's I think as an example of what the other side, the extreme other side, can look like. It's
Yeah.
yeah, the irony is of the physique and everything that represents versus actually this is a real struggle and a
Mm-hmm.
mental illness that people should um, take note of. And actually, conversations like this, they're good. They're healthy to have because
Yeah.
people come your way, which
Absolutely.
is good.
Yes. Yes.
Um, when it comes to, uh, I want to talk about. I mean, there's so many different avenues to go on here. I'm looking at my questions and actually have answered. As I said, we'd go on loads of tangents, and they've been wonderful tangents.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pleased we have. Um,
Mm-hmm.
on your Instagram and your work, you mentioned the RPE eating cycle. Could you tell us what that
Mm-hmm.
is and how's it effective?
Absolutely, yeah. So this is something that I coined a few years ago. It's something that I was practicing with clients, but it wasn't named yet, and it wasn't as defined as it is now. But I gave a talk at during Kabuki Education Week because I was speaking and writing a lot about the ways that we use intuition in our training. Because at this point in time, this is around 2019, there was so much dialogue around intuitive eating and how it was ineffective. And really, it was just that people didn't know what intuitive eating is meant for. Like they think, well, if it's not going to lead to weight loss or physique change, then it's not effective. Why pursue it? What's the point?
Could you define intuitive eating just quickly?
Yes, yeah. So intuitive eating is a weight neutral framework that's intended to help people essentially repair their relationship with food and their body image by unlearning diet culture and um, utilizing more internal cues to guide their eating. And weight neutral just means that it's not anti-weight change. It's just that we aren't tracking weight because weight is just an outcome and it's not a very controllable outcome. Whereas we can better track and implement behavior change. We're actually paying attention to behaviors. So intuitive eating is the equivalent would be like physical therapy. You don't go to physical therapy to prep for a powerlifting meet. And to say physical therapy doesn't work because it's not gonna get you to a powerlifting meet is a misunderstanding and a misapplication. So intuitive eating is not meant for weight change. It's certainly not meant to get you to your leanest physique. It's meant to help you repair the injury that has occurred between you and your relationship with food and your body. So people were knocking intuitive eating because it was based on internal cues. And I was like, hey, wait, isn't everyone talking about like autoregulation and like reps in reserve and rate of perceived exertion and training? It is exactly the same skill. It's interoceptive sensitivity. It's the ability to accurately interpret your internal cues. And then autoregulation is the application of that information to make changes to your training plan that was rooted, it had some plan. You went in there knowing with the intention of what you wanted to do, but based on your biofeedback, you make adjustments because your level of fatigue and whatnot is going to vary from day to day. And so I wrote an article about that. And then I thought, you know what, this is what I've been helping my clients do. And actually a way to make it more understandable to people is to then apply it to the RPE scale. And so it started very basically as just a way to apply, rate our hunger levels in the same way that we rate our RPE. And if it's very low, like if our hunger levels are at a 1 or a 2, we're super hungry. It's very hard to make intentional decisions about food. We're probably under fueling. That's not going to support our performance. In the same way that if your training is always at a level 1 or 2, very easy, you're not going to support your performance. You're not going to support your health maybe in that direction either. And the same thing can be said at the extreme edge. If we're getting to a 9 or a 10, every once in a while, yeah, you might hit that point, but you can't train at a 9 or a 10 consistently because you're going to injure yourself. And you don't want to eat until you feel uncomfortably full to the point of being sick, because that's not going to support your health or performance. So we want to aim somewhere in the middle, anywhere from like a 3 to a 7. And if we do that with the application of our nutritional knowledge, we can feasibly change our body composition. And I've seen that this is played out in research on hunger training. So people of anywhere from normal body weight all the way up to having obesity and a range of blood glucose control, when they pursue hunger training, they improve their blood glucose control. And some groups will either maintain body weight over a long period of time, or lose body weight and maintain that over a long period of time. So to me, it started in that form of being just a very simple way to use your internal cues and quantify those, and not have to use macros, because you're still making intentional decisions about what you want to eat. And over time, that's evolved because I've seen, more research has emerged about weight neutral approaches to health and even performance. I reference so many times the Helms article about having a sustainable nutrition paradigm in physique sports. And if we look at intentional weight change like a contact sport, there's inherent risk. People should be informed of the risk, and it can be mitigated with proper technique and equipment. Then the proper technique and equipment is to ensure that you are utilizing a self-monitoring method that is not going to exacerbate your predisposition to disordered eating. So macros may not be a good fit for everyone. And to use things like internal cues and biofeedback, and to decrease our preoccupation with our appearance and our body size, and to ensure that we have social support and that we are meeting our other needs effectively. And so that's why over time I developed these core RP eating skills that start with the basics of accurately identifying our hunger and fullness cues, and whether we're having a hunger signal or just an appetite signal or an emotional signal. And from there, learning how to identify our non-food triggers. So when I'm actually not hungry, or not hunger triggers, I should say, I'm not hungry, but I want to eat because of something that's going on. And then being able to identify what those triggers are, why they exist, and if I don't need food, what do I need instead? And then that's skill 3, which is meeting our needs more effectively. And then you're kind of practicing the 4th skill over time, but it becomes much easier then to eat for both satiety, which is a physical sensation of no longer being hungry, and satisfaction, which is the ability to know what is going to hit the spot for that meal. Like am I going to eat this thing, and then I'm going to say, that's all I needed of that. That was great. And I'm going to move on. And that can be anything from a Reese's cup to a full meal that you're going to have, in before training or after training. And then applying our nutritional knowledge. So we know the functions of foods, especially people who've been macro tracking for a long time. And then our self-awareness of what's actually going on for me and what do I really need right now? Is it food? What type of food? If it's not food, is it something else? So the purpose is not that we're like accidentally hitting our correct macros. The purpose is that we are moving away from relying on macros to direct our food choices. And instead we're using what we could call intuition, but I really say interoceptive awareness and sensitivity and our knowledge. And then we're fueling based on all of that information. And we can adjust if we want to, if it's appropriate for a person, like a strength athlete who might need to change their body weight. If we say, I'm going to eat a lot of high volume foods, I'm going to aim for a lower level of fullness at the end of my meal. And I'm going to see what that does for my body. And over time, it's likely that I will be able to steer myself toward a lower or higher body weight. And I've done this with clients, I've done this with myself, and we generally don't track weight. I haven't tracked weight in the past, but I've done this during bulking. I should say bulking, but like I wanted to increase the size of my hamstrings and my glutes. So I thought, well, I've been gifted a pie, and it's a pie that you can freeze. And so my plan is I'm going to eat most of my normal meals, and then if I feel like I'm only maybe at a level 5 at the end of this meal, then I'm going to have some pie until I get to a level 6 or a level 7. And that was very effective. I mean, along with training and nutritional awareness. And the same can be said for moving in the opposite direction. That if it's like I'm feeling, I'm gearing up for a meet, or for some individuals that are in large bodies for whom weight loss would objectively improve their health markers and their well-being. It's about learning yourself and your cycles, and then you're able to again build those meals for satiety and satisfaction, so you can guide your energy balance in one way or another, but still doing that with many of the protective factors that macro tracking lacks. And it can also be done in a completely weight neutral paradigm, and it can even be applied to macros. If someone is anxious about moving away from macros, you can have your macro planned plate, but still say, well, actually, instead of cleaning the plate, because that's what I've habituated myself to do, I'm actually going to tune in halfway through the meal, 3/4 of the way through the meal, monitor my hunger levels, and then say, oh, I'm actually at a 5 already. I'm just going to put this back and eat it later if I need it. So it's a skill that can be sort of hybridized as well, and can be a stepping stone to moving more toward those internal cues. And I want to say the caveat is it's not going to be a perfect fit for everyone. And you may need to use some external cues because you may be on medications, or, on the spectrum of neurodivergence where it's hard for you to tune into your internal cues. So then we rely on things like timing. If it's been 4 or 5 hours since my last meal, then I probably need to eat. Or instead of feeling stomach hungry, I just feel irritable and tired. And that's a cue that I need to eat. And I'm going to do some plate planning instead of just relying totally on my internal cues. So it's also modifiable in that way. So it's really evolved to be more complex and nuanced and meet the needs of more individuals, whereas it started as just like hunger, level of 1 to 10.
Mm. I feel like that's one of the best sort of, I hate the word mental model, but it's a mental framework, right? It's a principle that loads of things can go downstream of, and I can
Yeah.
completely see how that's powerful. I guess what gets measured gets managed. Oh, is that right? Yeah, that comes to mind in the sense of you're
Yes.
changing the external measurement to something internal, and then over time
Yes.
that through reps, that I guess internal muscle and awareness or
Mm-hmm.
introspection can build.
Yep.
And then you've got suddenly a spectrum, because I can imagine most people haven't even thought of it like that. They've been living with this
Yeah.
for years, but have never thought of, okay, am I like a 5 full or a 3 full, or like
Right.
a full blown like 24 out of 10? Like what is it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just even giving people the framework, I can see the validity in it, and I'm sure you get
Mm-hmm.
a lot of good response from your clients as well.
Yeah, and even I've had a few people that are just in my life that have heard about it, and then, after some weeks, oh, I've been doing that RP eating thing, and I actually lost a lot of weight. Like I literally was never paying attention,
Mm.
and I'm like, oh, that's if that was your goal, then like that's fantastic. It's an outcome of them being able to better tune into themselves and meet their own needs, and also realize like the ability to control their body and follow macros and whatnot. Like that's not tied to their self-worth. It really is about, oh, I'm able to respond to my needs effectively. And I think that is it's like a wholesome and positive thing to be able to say about yourself. Not I can control my body, or I can follow macros for 5 years, forever, regardless of what my actual needs are. But to say I actually know myself very well, and I know what I need, and I can meet my emotional needs, my mental needs. That's a powerful skill.
I absolutely agree. And I think just because it's hard to quantify doesn't mean it's not valuable, right?
Exactly.
Are a couple of little quick fires to before we wrap it up, because I'm conscious of
Mm-hmm.
time. Although I can talk to you all day, it's really fun.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any quotes or ideas you sort of essential to your life that you try and live by?
Oh yes, yes, absolutely. There's a Kurt Vonnegut quote: "We are only as healthy as our thoughts are humane." And he was a humanist, and so essentially he wasn't really didn't have like strong religious beliefs or anything like that. He's like a sci-fi author, but he knew that it was important to be a good person, to be kind just for the purpose of being kind. So I think that's an important thing to think about, because, especially when we're thinking about like, what does it mean to be healthy? If you have inhumane thoughts toward yourself or toward other people, like how healthy can you really be? Because your intentions are always going to come from a place of judgment and fear and anger and whatnot. So that's a big one for me. And then this was part of a longer quote, but it's every crack is also an opening. And it's about the way that like a chick comes into the world. It has to be born by eating its shell. It's like the way to be born while you're still alive is to eat yourself. And I have been, I feel like I've reinvented and I've started over in my life several times in very big ways. And there have been times when it felt like everything was going wrong and everything was coming apart. And I mean, really, I would say 3 years ago, things came apart. Everything came apart. And that's when I was really able to see what was behind like my cycles and thought patterns and behaviors, and clean it out and like start from a place where I felt very centered and aligned with myself. And so like that crack, that when things are breaking down, not to say it's not painful. I'm not trying to be toxically positive here, but it can be an opportunity to say like, oh, actually now I can change things. Like I'm starting from zero, absolute zero. Well, it can't get any worse, So let's see if we can help make it better. So I think those are the two big ones.
Wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And can you please tell us about your latest podcast? I think it's quite topical of everything you just said.
Oh, with Dylan?
No,
Or, oh no! Oh, you
your
mean
podcast.
you Santa de Fe? Oh,
Yeah,
wow, Salto de Fe. Yes, my podcast. I
yeah,
was like, oh yeah, I just had one with Dylan DaCosta. We talked about similar things. Yes, so the
yeah.
Salto de Fe podcast, and I don't want to say I've been neglecting it. I've been knowingly putting it on pause because I had so many things that I wanted to do, with the RP eating course. But yeah, so I created that podcast. It's kind of an interesting story. So my partner has a bag of coffee that's Salto de Fe coffee. And he was explaining to me that he's kept this bag for so many years because he saw it when he was making a huge change in his life. And Salto de Fe means leap of faith. And I was like, oh my God, I love that, and then I realized like I've done that. I mean, even recently, like selling my house, moving to another country, like kind of starting over. And I had uh, done my recent leap of faith was to put out the gut health course, and like it was a flop. It was, and I'm okay with saying that. Like I really had high hopes. It did not go well, and I was like, oh man, you know what? But this might be my crack. This is the crack that's the opening for me to say I'm going to retire from doing gut health content, which is a huge leap of faith because that's been the majority of my platform. That's kind of how I got to where I am. But I was like, I just feel burnt out. This isn't aligned with my values and what I really want to give to the fitness community. And so I'm going to retire and I'm going to pursue other avenues that I feel passionate about. And so that gave me the opportunity to really focus back on RP eating and develop it and actually like give it life, rather than it being just this sort of like little skeleton of an idea that I had. So I also started that podcast in the process because I was like, I want to be able to talk about taking these leaps of faith, because things like moving away from macros is a leap of faith, stopping the pursuit of thinness is a leap of faith. And I wanted to talk about it in a way that's more real. That's not just what we hear all the time, like, oh, it was a leap of faith and it was super successful. I want to have the opportunity to have discussions about leaps of faith where things actually didn't work out, because sometimes that happens and it's okay. Like not everything has to be a success story. It can be just a learning opportunity. And I did learn a lot about how to market and whatnot during, and how to put a course together. It was still incredibly valuable for me. It was just that particular leap of faith didn't turn out the way that I hoped that it did, but I still was able to take something away from it. And so actually my plan is, after this, part of the reason I came to my co-working space today, so I can finally record another episode and, kind of update on what's been going on. But that's my plan, is to focus more on that as well and bring in people, even, previous clients who've done similar things. And, for some it worked out really, really well, and that's beautiful. And for others it didn't, and they deserve to tell their stories too.
Definitely. I think
Hmm.
it's a whole exercise in reframing, whether it be your diet, your eating habits, or a perceived failure. Is it a stepping
Yep.
stone or a tombstone? Right? It's often the
Right.
former, not a tombstone.
Hmm.
So best of luck with the podcast, and people can find it
Thank
on
you.
YouTube.
Yeah, it's on YouTube. It's Salto the Fae Pod, and then I also have it on Instagram. So you can, it's like linked in my vitamin PhD link tree and bio. So you can find it all there. And yeah, there are 2 episodes, and then like a couple little shorts so far. So I'm hoping to definitely build that out more
Yeah,
in the next
great.
coming
Well,
year.
we'll subscribe for sure.
Awesome,
Um,
thank you.
well, Dr. Gabrielle Fundaro, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story. I really enjoyed talking to you. Really fun, learnt loads, and let's do it again sometime.
Awesome, absolutely. Thank you so much.